So way back in the beginning, we read up to I believe we read right up through the different names of the bodhisattvas, and then we stopped with Manjushri asking the questions. Did we read that portion of text, or do you want? Remember? I think we did, although we haven't commented on it. I think we read up to that point. Okay, so let's. We read a large section, and I'm trying to work through the various dimensions of this, which is a recurring vision or presentation of the nature of reality from an enlightened being's perspective. And we went through last time talking about the light. We've gone through the 4 continents, northwest, south, and east. Uttarakuru being the last one. And these, of course, are surrounded by or intertwined with these great oceans, these ringed mountains. And then it mentions the presence of bodhisattvas who are also illumined by this light. The text could mean a number of things here, that the bodhisattvas are made visible to others who are able to be participants in this assembly, so that they can actually see these bodhisattvas, or the bodhisattvas are themselves illumined through the light, and both. But in this case it says the bodhisattvas are being seen being born, they're being seen leaving home, so they're going through the stages of their spiritual cultivation, which turns out to be something of a replication of the Buddha's awakening experience from the time that he's born, time begins a spiritual journey, and then the leaving home or the going forth into, it's a solitary kind of pursuit for X amount of time, breaking through the riddle of birth and death, and then becoming an enlightened one. So you see, then you have the Thus Come Ones, another title for the Buddha, accomplishing proper enlightenment. And these are done in numbers, not a singular one, but billions of these are going on simultaneously through the 3 periods of time. Then they literally turn the Dharma wheel, which is to give the teaching. And the turning of the Dharma wheel here can be everything from formally hosting one of these assemblies in these Mo worlds, which is pretty far out, to manifesting across all the realms of existence, teaching and transforming. So the turning of the Dharma wheel is just a broad generic term for manifesting, giving the teachings. And this can be done not necessarily with even words, it can be done through deeds, through actions, through imagery, through icons, and so forth. But it's a general statement of what goes on in this process after the awakening. There's the turning of the Dharma wheel. It's replicated in a small scale daily with monks and nuns who, in return for receiving offerings of food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, then give Dharma in return. So there's a reciprocity built into this. But they don't just leave, whatever that means. They don't go into a non-abiding, extinct state, but they continue entering, coming back, going and returning, the sutra says, with no boundaries. In other words, although they're going and returning, what is a boundary for us is not a boundary for them. And so this continuum between life and death is merely a continual transformation for them coming into being. And they said they do this over and over and over again. Manifest being born, bringing forth the resolve, observing the conditions of the world they're born into, beginning the spiritual path until they attain this enlightenment. And time here is not relevant, how long this takes. One should not think of it in terms of years, but in terms of shifts in consciousness that occur maybe in one lifetime, maybe over many lifetimes. And then, of course, it goes into mentioning now these various kings, Sumeru kings of the mountains, the 4 kings, and now we're into the billion heavens, and it says of the 33, Suyama Tushita, bliss from transformation heavens, comfort gained by others transformation, Brahma multitudes, light sound heavens, lots of heavens here. It's not just one heaven. Pervasive purity, vast results heaven, billion ultimate form heavens. All these were revealed in that light. Okay, so before we go on much further, let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. What we were talking about previously was there's a cosmology presented here, and it consists of many dimensions, many planes of reality or existence. The Avatamsaka used the concept worlds to just generally talk about this. And they say there's worlds within worlds. And this is broken down into worlds within time, worlds in space, and I would say worlds in existence or being, if you want to use a fancy word, ontology. So what you have is a cosmology that's very interwoven, a temporal one being the division of existence of a world into 4 discrete moments. So you have a time dimension to these worlds. Anybody know the 4? It's not directional. In other words, the temporal time dimension for these worlds is a pattern where they're broken down into 4 discrete moments. Okay, not literally moment clock, but segments of time. Past, present, future could usually not. But they do move through the dimensions of past, present, and future if you add ad infinitum on both ends of that. Okay? So in other words, there's never posited here a moment of creation, a beginning. You just have to, you just have to work with, or somebody just said with, how do they put it, Lee? Get used to it. It's just, I know, and your mind goes, well, wait a minute. I can sort of maybe imagine ad infinitum continuously, but how can there never be a beginning? And I've never seen that in these texts as posited. They say from beginningless time. So I'm not going to try to explain that tonight. That would be foolish. I'm just throwing it out for you to say it doesn't have a beginning and an end. So past, present, and future is continuous, non-stop. Whatever you can do with working with that. It's usually, anybody else on the 4, what it might be? Yes?
Arising, abiding, ceasing, and then non-existing?
Yeah, basically, there's different ways. One is talking about the coming into form, coming into existence. The second one is a duration or an abiding period of time. The next is a dissolving or a coming apart. And then finally, a state of being dissolved. So that these worlds have 4 distinct, and these are meant to also, these are 4 marks, lakshana, that are mentioned in the text as being part of conditioned reality for everyone. So we too have a time when we're coming into being, our genesis. There's a time too where we have a duration, I mean relative to, let's take the normal human lifespan from what, I guess 0. 0 to 80 in tenths. Yeah. So let's say the coming into being is from conception to, I don't know, 40 or 50, no, somewhere around adolescence, post-adolescence is a time. Then there's a time where you mature and you abide. It's usually when you do your major work somewhere around your 20s, 40, 50, 55, depending on. And then there's a time when it starts to sort of come apart, get a little rough at the edges. Yeah, some of you are nodding, some of you are like, what do you mean? I have no idea. Well, it will happen. The hair thins, it turns colors. The skin gets a little flabbier, the muscles are less strong. The teeth get holes in them and on the inside and they wear away on the outside. They fall out. Anything else people want to mention? The joints start to break down. I've got 2 really strong ones, but they're made of titanium. I wasn't born with them. My originals dissolved, so they're going back. They came into being. So there's a part of my body that came into being while the rest of it's going on. So it's interesting how these four can work across. Sparkling eyes go, rosy complexion goes. If you want to read some really wonderful poetry on this phenomena of the 4 stages, Shakespeare's sonnets can't be beat. I would just say if you really... they're wonderful, describing this process. So if you've never read Shakespeare's sonnets, take a look. But poets describe this very well. And then the time of dissolution when our body, the elements, earth back to earth, ashes to ashes, and dust to dust, as the song goes. So you see this also with, they say, with the cyclical nature of the seasons. Spring would be the time coming into flowering and being. Summer, the abiding, fall, the sort of the gray hair and the cavity period of your, and then winter when things are gone and dormant and then comes back again. So that's the temporal dimension. Now the interesting thing about the temporal dimension, which is kind of tricky, is time is not measured like this. This is really, how did it go? Next week, there's a great line from the Grateful Dead on sort of like, it goes something like, get rid of your clock or put it down, get your watch, put it down. The only thing it's measuring is the movement of its hands. It's something like that. Anybody know the line from the Dead? You think, who are the dead? You should go say, no. Okay, forget it. Yeah, so it's not talking about this measure of time. The time mentioned here is sometimes called like a kalpa. They measured in kalpas. We don't have kalpa watches. I don't think Omega or anybody's come out with a kalpa watch yet. So basically, these enlightened beings, when they see the nature of movement through space, what we call time, over vast periods of change, they measure it in terms of kalpas, and there's a small kalpa, a medium-sized kalpa, and a great kalpa, so they come in sizes. You can supersize the kalpas, or you can, have the minimalist thing. And it's said that the world comes into being in a series of kalpas. The world forms in the series of kalpas. It continues through a series of kalpas, and then it dissolves. So it goes through these 4 stages in a matter of time called kalpas. And so how long does this continue? There's this wonderful passage from the Anguttara text, and the question is how long a world dissolution will continue, how long the abiding, how long the formation, how long the continuation of a form world. And O monks, says the Buddha, one can hardly say that it will be so many years or so many centuries or so many millennia or so many hundreds of thousands of years. In other words, you cannot put it into a category of time. And so this is kind of a description of the 4 world periods in a kind of discourse the Buddha gives on the all-embracing sense of impermanence, that even these worlds that us to seem, and this is interesting, it's one of the contemplations you can use as a meditation technique. You can begin, we use this in our early cultivation, what is it that doesn't change? What is it in my ordinary human experience that never changes? And you begin an inquiry both analytically and in quietude, just looking at and making observations. What in my ordinary experience does not change? What can I look to that is constantly unchanging? And the Buddhist hypothesis is you won't in your ordinary human experience find anything that does not change. And for a lot of people, this is an awakening. I mean, it sounds really silly, we might take that for granted, but psychologically we don't live in that moment of awareness. We live in an alternative moment of awareness, the Buddha called avidya, not seeing things clearly, where we think there's all sorts of things that don't change, starting with this. And so part of the dukkha, this dissatisfaction or suffering, comes because we psychologically, emotionally grab or want or insist or thirst for unchanging in the midst of something that is always changing. And so we never get requited. We never get the satisfaction of getting that, and we constantly go after it. And it leads to increasing frustration and disenchantment. So this is one of the stimulants for dissatisfaction, is facing up to this reality and then trying to make some sense of that. But this is also something that leads to a major impetus for the spiritual path. People in search for resolving this mystery. What does it mean to be only come in to pass away, and there's this brief interval in between in which how do you make sense out of it when everything in the end is gone? So it's a really profound, and it's not just for the Buddhist tradition. It cuts across, and it doesn't even cuts across religions. It cuts across anybody who's a thinking, feeling person. You can be an atheist, agnostic, whatever your, quote, persuasion, whatever that means, your orientation. This one is like the one big one. It's the one big matter. No matter where you go, you're not going to get away from that. And the Buddha said then, and I always find this both mind-blowing and comforting at the same time, this description of the time element here. And this is from the same text I was reading to you from the Anguttara. The Buddha gives a simile. He says, suppose amongst there was a huge rock of one solid mass. That's just a massive hunk of granite. 1 mile long, 1 mile wide, 1 mile high, without a split or a flaw. Okay? So imagine, you got a rock, 1 mile high, 1 mile long, 1 mile wide, without a split or a flaw. It's just a perfectly solid 1 mile rock. Okay? And at the end of every 100 years, a person would come by and rub against it once with a silken cloth. So every 100 years of our measured time, you would take your silken cloth, go out to the rock, 1 mile, 1 mile, 1 mile, and brush it with a silk cloth. And then that huge rock would wear off and disappear quicker than a world period. So he says, do not try to wrap your mind around what world periods. But of such world periods amongst, many have passed away, many hundreds, many thousands, many hundreds of thousands. And how is that possible? Inconceivable amongst is this samsara. Not to be discovered is any first beginning of beings who, obstructed by ignorance and ensnared by craving, are hurrying and hastening through this round of rebirths. So he's mapping out here a mind-blowing kind of dimension of time, that these worlds come into being, dwell, go back, and you would try to, you couldn't measure them even if after, the cloth were to do this and so forth. And he says, then you have beings within this temporal dimension who are constantly going through, and he gives us this description of samsara, which means the unawakened, continuous existence of ignorance and craving, hurrying and hastening through this round of rebirth. Sixth Patriarch says a bitter passage through life ends with a hurried or unthoughtful passage through life ends with bitter regret. So this is a description of the temporal. Any questions on that one? I mean, it's not, I don't know if there's, you'd have a question on it exactly, but what's being presented here is a dimension of the temporal nature of the worlds. I don't know what else we can. Nobody? Going once, going twice? Yes.
So,
And I hope this is just a comment and not a question, because I can't answer questions on these cosmologies. I can just present them.
how do we use this?
That's a great question. How do we use this? Anything occur to you?
Well, I think if this is what is going on, sometimes it's similar to kind of experience the vastness of the universe. It kind of gives you a sense of the scope. Like maybe my afflictions have a actually fairly small. I don't know. I mean, it's to kind of give you the grandeur, but also the scope of what is going on as well. I don't know. I'm trying to wrap my mind around it.
I suppose one could slip into, who the hell cares? And it's just like going on and on and on and on, right? And between that one silk wash and another and that rock, I got lots of time. At the same time, there's an urgency built in because he's describing samsara. There's a continuous replaying of going through these stages and dissolving without ever reaching satisfaction. And sort of like you're alive, but you're alive in a cage, like a panther, like Rilke's idea of the panther pacing back and forth within the cage, confined. And this goes on. So on one hand, there's a sense of infinite time available, seemingly, but there's also a carpe diem aspect of seize the moment now. Because as we go through these other levels here, and we're going to do another graph tonight, there's different planes of existence or different forms that you can take. And only in some of these do you have sort of the consciousness and the wherewithal to actually see what's going on and get some handle on it and move out of the path of unsatisfactory existence. The Buddha never says life is suffering. He says the unawakened life is suffering. And so there seems to be something that's put forth, a way of being that isn't caught up in this kind of continual affliction and suffering. But there's no way to get at it except in this moment. So this is the thing. You have an infinite time, and yet all you have is this moment to actually work on anything. It's like any project. You just mañana, siempre mañana. You keep putting it off, but it never happens, right? You don't put off eating. You eat now, right? You don't put off sleeping until next week, and so forth. And in the same way, the text is saying, don't put off this, because the moment you have now, the existential moment available to you, especially in the context of being exposed to these teachings and the therapeutic techniques and mechanisms for liberation that they're providing, is like a rare opportunity. And so it's sort of like, take advantage of this. You don't know when you're going to be sitting in this assembly again. So there's kind of a tension to these two dimensions of infinite time and only the moment. Attend to the here and now. That's really... yes?
This may be a wrong way of reading this text, but I was wondering, for something like this to be written, there must be some kind of a observation of reality or something like a seed. For example, this Jambu Dipas that land to the south and then east, west, and north. I was wondering, maybe Mount Sumeru is like the Himalayas, and Jambu Dipa is like India. So I was thinking maybe this geography is a little bit like this, and then at the same time, when they talk about the time frame, really, I was wondering if there was some very rich astronomical, cosmological kind of thinking that went on in the ancient times in India, wherever. So, like, for example, even the sun that looks like lasting forever and then solid does die one day, right? So I was thinking if there's any kind of a, sort of like a seed for, yeah, like a little, what's the word? Something that has to do with the reality as the people observed way long time ago. To come up with this kind of text. Because the text is so...
Well, the question is, who came up with this text?
yeah.
We went over that. I thought we went over this somewhat to the first class. Is
Second, earliest, maybe second, 200 something C, Common Era. And the latest maybe like 600, 400, 600 something, right? So, it's a long time ago.
yeah. Well, no, not if you're using the silk cloth and the rock. It wasn't a long time ago at all. What I'm trying to present here is you can use a hermeneutical lens, a lens of interpretation that says, well, this must be a cosmological view coming out of the mythologies of ancient India within this time. Okay, you can do that. And then these got carried over, the Buddhists adapted it and so forth, and these people just sat around under trees, kind of stoned, and like, wow, I imagine there's like this world called, and we'll call it Sumer. Let's call it Sumer, yeah. And then they just come up with these fanciful things. That's one way to interpret that. The text itself doesn't present itself that way. The text presents it as this description is how enlightened beings from beginning of time have seen the nature of reality. And so it happens to be passed along not in a cultural way or even a historical way, but something that's posed as transcultural and transhistorical. And again, we're going to wrestle with this throughout with this text. To what extent do we ask the text to fit into our ways of perceiving and knowing that have to do with history and time and culture and our spans? And to what extent do we let the text rub those borders or boundaries or containers we use and challenge them? And if nothing else in this text, all you do is go through a sort of both ego and cultural rubbing, challenging, disturbing of our conventional truths. It's a worthwhile thing to do. Just that. But if you go at it deeper and say, I wonder, or I'm open to, and the question I'm going to ask, we won't get to tonight, I thought we would, but we won't. The question I'm going to ask is, what instruments or mechanisms or faculties would you have to have in order to verify this? This is a very interesting question. If this is posited as the enlightened vision, not vision as in terms of visions, but the enlightened seeing of someone who is completely broken through all delusion and sees things clearly as they are, they're passing this along as a hypothesis. We've got to be honest here. Unless you really know this for yourself, or you have a kind of faith that never wavers, it's pretty hard to just say, I accept this as fact. But if it says to us, what you accept as fact is also something we want to look at, which is what the text is doing. So it's both challenging our preset, our preconceptions, our, I guess Heidegger called it our four structures of thought, the way we organize our senses to make sense of and put the world into some order. And we do it not by this time, not by this space, and not by this ontology that's being presented. So the first thing that comes up is we try to sometimes explain it away. You know, well, this was cool for those people back then who believed in such things, but nowadays we have modern science, and we don't need to rely on this kind of mythological presentation and so on and so forth. Or you could take the Avatamsaka and say, well, your science is like a grain of sand on the mountain of this reality. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's only a grain of sand on the mountain of this description. And while this can embrace your science as a mode of learning, there's hundreds of thousands of ways that living beings learn and know. Science is one of them. Science can't embrace this. So it's not on like an either or, it's just a positioning of where they fit. Give you an example, just push this a little bit. If you take the history of this planet, the Earth, as we know it through our science, I'm not talking about Avatamsaka now, okay? As we know it through our science, and I'm considering modern science, not necessarily Darwinian deniers, okay? Just as we accept modern science, with the biological and geological measurements that are used. Everybody following me here? Okay, species evolution, and then the dating of that through carbon dating and so forth, and rocks and stratification. Everybody knows all about this? Yeah, a couple hundred years ago, you'd have me burned at the stake for saying this, but now it's cool. I can say this. And you go, oh, yeah, that's right, evolution, geology, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't 7 days, it was 7 billion years, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, well, okay. Anyhow, if we take the Earth's duration of the planet and we condense it, or we put it into a 24-hour clock, so we say from what we know is the beginning of the Earth, that we can go back and say, here seems to be the first measurement we can take of how old the Earth is, prior to even the existence of life, just geologically, galactically speaking. And we then, instead of taking those billions of years and putting it over a span, we'd say it's 24 hours. Okay? So from the beginning to, as we're sitting here in Berkeley, right now in this room, we condense all of the time of just this planet, not other planets, just this planet, into 24 hours. Human beings don't make their appearance until 1 minute and 20 seconds before midnight. Whoa, wait a minute. And basically, they've calculated 11, 58, and 43 seconds. So you're going, well, wait a minute. So we really know this, and we say this about ancient India, and we're making these statements, when in fact, we just barely touched ground here in terms of a time span. I mean, think about it. It's like 1 minute and 20 seconds before midnight. Ta-da! And not only is it ta-da, that's what we think. We're going, and all the other things are going, what? Oh, we're here, we're people. And then you think, well, how long have we known anything within that minute and 20 seconds? I mean, I just go, for example, it wasn't until the 16th, 17th, well, let's see, probably about the 17th century that we figured out that maybe the Earth wasn't the unmoving center of the universe. Now, I don't know how many seconds that is of our 1 minute and 20, but that's a heck of a lot of time before we finally like, duh, we move. And up to that time, we thought it was silly because we didn't feel it moved. And we knew it didn't move because we didn't feel it moving. Do you feel it moving? Are you getting vertigo because the planet's spinning? No, well, that proves it doesn't move. Okay? So finally, you know, Copernicus and Galileo was the one who got the telescope, put it together and said, oh my gosh, we're moving. We're moving around the sun. And we're going, oh, that's a big discovery. Well, only 200 years after you discovered it was it finally admitted by a lot of authorities to be actually the truth. That was in 1822. And then, in 1992, he was finally forgiven for his errors. So here you got this species called human man being making all these statements and pronouncements and discoveries. And in fact, we are a little blip on a radar screen of immense time, and it's not for sure we even have a small corner of truth of what's going on out there. So I just point this out as sort of like, this text is so far out in comparison to where we stand right now. And yet where we stand right now, we assume is the high point of insight and knowing and knowledge. Our modern science really tells us a great deal. But if you look at the span of this, we have been wrong so many times on this, what's going on and why it's going on and what's going to happen next and so on and so forth. I mean, if we're so smart, how come we can't stop destroying ourselves with global warming? Oh, well, we didn't have the facts. Yes, we did. So there's still denying of the basic facts? Of course there is. So this being that knows all this stuff, wow, it's kind of strange. I don't want to get too much into that. I just got to the one dimension tonight about time, the temporal. But I wanted to point out, to answer your question, that what the text is asking us to do is to both be aware of how we're trying to make sense of it and also question the ways we would try to make sense of this. And give it some room to play with us and our presuppositions, and also ask a deeper question, which I want to ask, because I don't want to suggest that we take this on faith. I don't think that's very viable. It's not viable for me, okay? And so maybe it's viable for you, but if somebody else asks you to explain it, you just say it's a matter of faith, it's not going to go anywhere. And you're asking a very important question, what are we to make of this? Because if this has some relevance to our contemporary existence, and just taking it on faith doesn't get anywhere. Nor am I asking you to sort of just deny it on the basis of what we perceive to be our scientific current knowledge, but to somewhere allow a suspended judgment to occur where we enter this as a kind of challenge, exploration, a rubbing each week that we go through it and see what it can do in terms of, but the deeper question I think underlies this, if you're not going to take it on faith or dismiss it, is how would we validate this? I mean, to me that's a very important, how would we go about verifying what's being presented here? And if it's not presented to us as something we can know, then we're kind of like, we don't have any entry point into this text and its teachings. I mean, we're just standing on the outside or diving in with a kind of blind and questioning faith, which, from what we know from the sixth patriarch, gets you nowhere except at home plate with a bat on your shoulder. It doesn't get you around. You actually have to look at the ball, hit the ball, run, and do the whole thing in order to get there. But it's standing on first base, home plate with a bat on your World Series. I just bring. Well, the bat on your shoulders is not going to get you anywhere. So the texts are clearly saying to us, this is a replicable experience. So the next question we ask, we're reading this and saying, how in heck am I expected to replicate this understanding and awakening? And the next question would be, does the text give us any pointers in this regard? And I would say it does indeed. This text is embedded with the therapeutic, spiritual, contemplative exercises necessary to unpack it. And if we draw on other models like a cultural model, a historical model, a scientific model, what we're doing is taking little lenses on top of it, but we're not letting the text speak to us about its own inherent model, that it says, if you want to understand, this is what you need to do. And this goes into that. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no. It was interesting you were saying, what's our point of entry to understanding this? And that's exactly what I was thinking as you said it. Now I wanted to ask, is it, in your opinion, is it wrong perhaps to think of this as metaphor? I think that's what I guess my Western mind immediately says, like, okay, well, I can't understand, like, I don't think the Bible is correct, historically correct. I think that it's interesting metaphor. And that's a way for me to accept it to a certain point. But it also probably deflects some of the meaning that it originally was written to contain. And likewise with this perhaps. So is metaphor a useful point of entry for us with this, or is it distracting?
Yes.
No.
Let me, it's a really good question. I'm not making fun of the question. It's a very important question. At one time, say in my grandmother's era, I'll use her as an example. She believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible. So, as did her great-grandmother. That what was said in the Bible was literally true, factually true, and supported by natural science. Then, and for some people, it's as early as the Civil War, but for a lot of people, they don't hear about the new science of geology and biology that indicate, in fact, you could not literally assert the inerrant accuracy of the Bible, that you could not posit it, the world was created in 7 days and all of this, it just didn't work. And so, but as my grandmother gets into the early 1900s, her world then is shaken because she's exposed to, she was one of the first women to go to a college in where I was, and she got exposed to these new science classes, and it completely conflicted with the literal interpretation. So she tried many strategies. One was to say, well, this is one world, the world of the natural science I'm looking at, and this is another world, and they don't have to connect. But she couldn't keep them apart either, because two truths didn't sort of work. And so a number of strategies then evolved to help reconcile the tension that people were facing here. And one was metaphor. So we don't take this literally, we take it as metaphor, or as allegory, or poetically, that it's not describing literal time and space, but thematics that are recurring. So that was one way to do it. One other interpretation was to say these are two different realms of reality. One is telling us what, and the other one's telling us why. So science tells us what, religion tells us why. We don't have to have a conflict here. Another group said, I'm just going with science. I'm going to go with material positivism, and I'm only going to believe in what I can know through my six senses and empirical investigation. Anything outside of that is poo-poo, and I'm not even going to look at it. And there was another group that said, I'm only going to believe in the Bible, or the book, whatever you want to call it, as fundamentally, unchangingly true, and the rest of this is a modern fad that's going to pass away. And that was the birth of fundamentalism. And you still have elements of that working in people's minds. So if you ask how people reconcile the dissonance when this occurs, they come up with these various strategies. What the Avatamsaka seems to be saying is something close to Shakespeare's, there's more to heaven and earth than is dreamed of in your philosophy, Horatio. And it's also saying, but you can know this. It's not saying, well, this is a matter of faith. So while metaphor can be useful in some ways, it's very dangerous in a sense because it keeps you at the door but not going in. In other words, and it won't last as you get older, which I'm sure you won't, but you might, and as you face sort of the emptiness of the acquisition of stuff and you're really facing the mortal question, metaphor is not going to serve. It ain't going to deliver. You know, just, what is it? The Moody Blues, just give me some truth. All I want is some truth. You know, and what you want. And so, on one hand, if it keeps you from closing the door on it, it is useful. And it's not wrong to use it, but to realize that, in fact, it might be posing something more than metaphor. Yeah. And one of the keys to understanding this is a key line in this text, where this text comes from. Everything is made from the mind alone. So our constructions, our metaphors, are our ways of knowing and everything are actually generated from this mind that it's describing. And it creates all worlds and all realities and all perceptions and whatnot. Science is made from the mind alone. Religion is made from this mind alone. Wars are made from this mind alone. Peace is made from this. It's all made from this mind alone. And so this saying, let's get to know this mind that's doing all this, rather than looking at its creations and saying we're going to set up with this one or that one. It's really going deeply to the root of asking, what is the nature of this mind as it universally creates? And one of the beautiful passages from this text, it says, it's like this artist standing before a blank canvas who's got all these pastels of color and then starts using them in the same way the mind creates all the different worlds. And so where we won't go tonight, we won't have time, besides this temporal one I talked about, there's a spatial dimension. And that spatial dimension has to do with a vertical and a horizontal cosmology. The vertical are all the different beings that move through these worlds of existence. So it's describing the continuum of life energy, of matter and energy, as it moves through and takes on different forms, created by the minds of the living beings. So it's describing a genesis process, a creating process, driven by our mind and our karma, that actually goes and creates all these. It's not that they're preset, but they're rather coming into being and being sustained and going out as our consciousness shifts them. For example, in the Earth story, it talks about there isn't just one hell, nor are all the hells made already. They're constantly evolving. New hells will emerge with new hellish thoughts that we generate. So there will be a specific hell for genetically engineered mutants. There'll be a specific hell for certain chemical biological weapons that wasn't there, 200 years ago. It comes about through the karma and consciousness of living beings. So what you're getting here is not, this is the cosmology, and there's these realms, and we just go knocking on these doors, and we get in through some mistake, and then we get out, so someone saves it. No, it's not like that at all. It's describing this totally interpenetrating consciousness of matter and energy that's going on continuously, and we are moving through it all the time. And so it's saying, get to know this, and get to know that you are the driver. This mind that you have is the actual mechanism that's determining all this, even if you're not using it well and you're not aware of it. But the text is saying, so, you want to get to see this, you want to get a handle on this, you've got to get to know your own mind. And that begins with your question of what are we to do with this? And the question would be, what are you doing without it? Sorry, go ahead.
We've been using a lot of verses from songs tonight. It seems to me this text takes one from Bob Dylan. When you get tired of all this ceaseless repetition, won't you come see me, Queen Jane?
When
you get tired of all this ceaseless repetition, won't you come see me, Queen Jane?
I didn't get the last line.
Won't you come see me, Queen Jane?
Oh, Queen Jane. The Buddha might change Dylan's words a little bit. Would be, when you get tired of all the ceaseless repetitions, why don't you come see me in the mirror? In other words, there's nothing inherently repetitious about anything we're doing. It is our making of it that it becomes a repetition. This is why this text is so powerful, because on one hand it seems like it's really far out, cosmology, belief in all these beings. On the other hand, it's going right into the heart of the pulsing of your choices, decisions, and the results of that at the finest level. So when we get to the 10 grounds, or the 10 stages, you're seeing how the Bodhisattva starts to finally uncover the workings of his or her mind, and how this leads to this, leads to this, and leads to this. It's a anatomy of human consciousness and liberation or imprisonment. But this thing is really dynamic and fluid. I'm trying to make it, I may be going not as fast as you hope, but I'm trying to bring these dimensions out as we go into this. Otherwise, we just come at this as a faith-based text, or as a mythological story from the past or as metaphor, and none of that would be necessarily useless, but I don't find it particularly useful, especially at my age. I'm not, I'm not interested in doing that so much. But as a mechanism for liberation and insight, if we can take this and just relax a little, because one of the things that happens when we come at it, we're not there. Our point of departure is not where these bodhisattvas are. So when they're seeing this and hearing this, they've already covered a lot of ground for self-understanding and breaking through a lot of attachments and illusions. We're just, as I said before, just think of yourself as eavesdropping. You're peeping through, you're eavesdropping, peeping through a hole outside the fence and watching this thing, going on in there. It's not necessarily where you're at, but all of a sudden you're going, oh my gosh, look at that. In fact, there's a wonderful, from the Avatamsaka preface, it says, when brought to search in this, it's like looking through a keyhole and seeing boundless space. Thus one time is all time, and one place is all places. This is from the preface. So we're looking through a keyhole. We're beginning to look through the keyhole. Next week, we'll go into the spatial, and we'll go into these planes of existence and continue. I don't know. I actually feel that if we don't take time to do these questions and explore in this way, we're not even riding the horse looking at the flowers. We're just riding the horse and tromping on the flowers. But anyhow, so I'll continue to do this if, and do continue to ask questions, because I think the questions really help open it up. Different audiences will ask different questions. Different times of your development, you'll ask different questions. But don't hold the questions back. Because that makes the text then, if we can, bridge into where you are right now. Okay.
Okay, so maybe just announcements for the monastery. So on Sunday we have a family program after lunch. I think something at
Can you get the
1:30.
mic?
Over that. Okay. I'll say, so just announcements for the monastery. Tomorrow we have a family kind of program at 1:30. Oh, sorry, Sunday at 1:30. The Bhayagiri community is coming on the first Tuesday. So not this Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. I think Ajahn Pasna will be coming down. Our regular programs are all happening. Wednesdays, Stephen Tainer. Thursdays, James Baraz. I hear this upcoming week's Eve Decker is going to come and play some Dharma music. So,
Who?
Eve Decker, she's a musician, a Buddhist musician. Yeah, it's a singer. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else specifically that we have coming up. We have Amitabha retreat up at 16,000 Buddhas. I believe it's the second week in December. There's a poster out in the hallway if you're interested. You can go to DRBU, or extension.drbu.edu if you want to find more information.
I think we should have a new ceremony. We have bathing the Buddha.
Yeah.
And we have Ulumbana. I think we should have the Silk Rock ceremony.
Silk Rock ceremony.
And just every year we all go out there and we just take the silk cloth and rub the rock once, and we feel like, I don't feel so old. And we just wait how many generations it takes to rub that rock down.
Yeah.
I guess it's a Buddhist Sisyphus. No, it's not really. It's not a Buddhist Sisyphus. I was just joking, because eventually the rock disappears. You break through it. So. Okay. Online okay? Very happy. I can't believe that, but that's okay. I think there's more people online than are alive. Well, I didn't mean to say that they're not alive. Let me rephrase that. More people online than offline. But there are some people who are more here when they're online, and there are some people who are more online when they're here. So, if you understand my meaning. Okay.
May every living be, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness luminous.
kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise.